Hey everybody, it's Kevin Wallace, double CCIE and Cisco Press author, and in this video I'm going to simplify connecting T1 and E1 circuits to Cisco routers. You're going to learn how they work and how to set them up. Stay tuned. We're starting off with a really fundamental topic today. It's all about T1s and E1s. The theory behind how they work, and we'll go out to a live interface and see how to set them up as well. But let's begin by thinking more generically about digital circuits as compared to analog circuits. We know that T1s, E1s, they're digital circuits. They're synchronized, they have clocking. The routers that we have, or whatever device is terminating these circuits, they know when one bit stops and another bit starts. But one of the big advantages we have with digital circuits as opposed to analog circuits is, with the digital circuit, we can have multiple conversations going on at the very same time on a single circuit. For example, in the voice world, I could have multiple conversations going on simultaneously on a T1, while if I had a single FXS port, a foreign exchange station port, that's an analog voice port, I can only have one conversation. So we start to get some economies of scale if we need to support multiple simultaneous conversations for the voice world, but this isn't just for voice. We could also send data over a T1 or an E1, and let's contrast T1s and E1s just a bit. We're more likely to see T1s and the more speedy brother of T1s, the T3. Those are popular in North America and Japan, while E1s and E3s are more popular outside of North America and Japan. And we mentioned that we could use this for data, not just voice, even though we're focused on collaboration. We could use this for data circuits. And these could terminate in what I think of as a digital modem, a CSU DSU, a channel service unit, a data service unit. Think of that as a digital modem as opposed to the traditional analog modem where you had all the all those little noises that you're accustomed to back in the day when you used to dial into America Online or something like that. And if we are using this for data, we could run some sort of a layer 2 protocol over this T1 or E1, like PPP, the point-to-point protocol. That might be a good choice. Now let's contrast the speeds for just a moment. If we are using this for data, T1s, this is a very familiar bandwidth amount that we need to know for the real world, 1.544 megabits per second. We just need to know that a T1 has 1.544 megabits per second of bandwidth. An E1 has more bandwidth. It can support 2.048 megabits per second. Now, this is what I think is really interesting and not at all intuitive. One might guess that because an E1 has more bandwidth than a T1, wouldn't you just guess that an E3 would have more bandwidth than a T3? Well, that's not the case. It's not even close like you can see on screen. A T3 weighs in at a bandwidth of 44.7 megabits per second, but about 10 meg per second shy of that is an E3 at 34.4 megabits per second. Let's think about how we can send multiple simultaneous conversations over a single T1 circuit. We'll begin with a T1. We'll talk more about E1s later. But on a T1, or an E1 for that matter, we could use something called TDM, time division multiplexing. This is a way for us to send multiple simultaneous conversations over a single circuit. And the way it works goes back to your kindergarten days. Remember when you were very young, maybe in kindergarten, maybe in first grade, you learned how to share? A lot of people I know miss that day. But that's really what's happening here with time division multiplexing. We are sharing the bandwidth. We're taking turns. Let's zoom in on one of these T1 packets and let's examine the 24 different channels inside of this T1 circuit. We'll see later that an E1 has more channels, but here a T1 has 24 channels. And I'm showing you the first 3, and then there's a bunch more, and then I show you the last one, channel 24. Here's how we can send multiple simultaneous conversations over a single circuit. We're going to take turns. We're going to send a sample from channel 1, and then channel 2, and then channel 3, and all the other channels all the way up to channel 24, and then we do it again. Another sample from channel 1 and 2 and 3 all the way through channel 24. We've got all these lined up and we'll transmit over the wire like that. That's how we do it. That's the magic of how we send multiple simultaneous conversations over a single circuit. Every channel gets, to paraphrase Whitney Houston, it's one moment in time. It gets a time slice during which it can send its data. Now, interestingly, when we're sending data over a T1 circuit, we don't send just one sample or even one T1 frame by itself. Let's do a bit of math, and I want to show you some different ways that we can transmit, that we can group together these voice samples for transmission across the T1 circuit. It's called framing, and I want to do a bit of math with you. Now, we've already said that a T1 has 24 channels, and I'll go ahead and tell you that the sample, we saw samples being sent earlier, a single sample is made up of 8 bits. We've got 8 bits per channel, 24 channels, and in a single T1 frame, in addition to having 8 bits for each of these 24 channels, we've also got a framing bit. A framing bit determines where one frame stops and another frame starts. That's sort of the delimiter to say, all right, here's a brand new frame coming, and all that combines to give us a T1 frame. 8 times 24, 192, plus 1 framing bit, 193. A T1 frame has 193 bits. Well, the next question is, how many of these frames, how many of these samples for every channel should I be sending per second? And the answer dates back to the 1920s, believe it or not. There was a doctorate of electrical engineering. He was working for AT&T. His name was Harry Nyquist. And back in the late 1920s, and this theory sort of evolved over the years, but it dates back to the 1920s, and it's called the Nyquist theorem. And Harry Nyquist's theorem was that if you want to reproduce an analog waveform based on samples that you take, the minimum number of samples that you need to take is twice the highest frequency. Think about it. We're really playing a game of connect the dots. If you go to a movie and you're watching a movie, they're commonly projected at 24 frames per second. If you see 24 images projected in rapid succession up on the silver screen, it can make your eye believe that you're watching smooth motion when in reality you're watching several still images. Same thing with audio. We can sample the volume, the amplitude of an analog waveform, and then play those amplitude values back out. We can represent numerically the volume of each of these samples, transmit that number over a data network, and reproduce that on the other side. How many samples do we take though? Well, Harry Nyquist said twice your highest frequency. Now, the human ear, depending on your age and how much rock music you listened to when you were a teenager, the human ear can hear from about 20 hertz at the low end to about 20,000 hertz at the high end. As you get older, that 20,000 number seems to decline quite rapidly. But when we're talking about regular telephone networks, we're not trying to have Dolby surround sound or anything that's super high fidelity. We're trying to communicate, and we typically don't want to burn extra bandwidth to make the audio sound pristine. No, we want to get information across the network. And it's fascinating that over 90% of the frequencies that make up human speech intelligence, over 90% of those frequencies are below 4,000 hertz. If you just heard below 4,000 hertz in a conversation with a human, you're getting 90% of that human speech. And that's plenty in order to understand what the other person is saying. Sure, it's not going to be like they're sitting across the desk from us, but it's going to be understandable. And for decades, the telephone company has said, yeah, we're going to say that 4,000 hertz is the highest frequency that we'll be transmitting. Actually, they cut it a little bit lower. They have some overhead just below 4,000 hertz for other things, but they say in general about 4,000 hertz. That's as high as we would ever try to transmit. Well, what is 2 times 4,000? It's 8,000. Harry Nyquist is telling us that we need to have 8,000 samples, 8,000 of these T1 frames sent every second. Now, by the way, I'm saying 4,000 hertz is all we need for a traditional telephony network. Remember, when you get into your collaboration studies, Cisco has the Cisco TelePresence solution where you've got high-definition video and really good quality audio. It surpasses the 4,000 hertz. It is very realistic audio, and of course it's going to take up extra bandwidth, but here we're talking about traditional T1 circuits. We're not trying to send super high fidelity sound over those T1 circuits. This is a traditional telephone circuit. Now, we've already said that we've got 193-bit frames. We had 24 channels. We're sending 8 bits per channel, and then we're adding on a framing bit. That adds up to 193 bits per frame. And the Nyquist theorem tells us that we need to be sending 8,000 of these 193-bit frames every second. If you multiply 193 by 8,000, that's where we get the magic number. That's where that 1.544 megabit per second number comes in. And we now see that we've got these 193-bit frames, but we don't send a single T1 frame by itself. We group that single frame together with lots of other frames. Couple of ways of doing that. One way of doing that that's not as common anymore is called a super frame. A super frame is 12 193-bit T1 frames that are attached end to end. Think of gluing these 12 different frames together. And honestly, I've never run across a super frame circuit in the real world. Every T1 circuit that I've ever worked on has been an ESF, an extended super frame circuit. Now, I know that there were super frame circuits out there in the region of the country where I live. Many years ago, Bell South, I know they would offer a super frame circuit at a lower cost as compared to an extended super frame circuit. But the idea is super frame, 12 frames glued together, extended super frame, 24 frames glued together. All right, what significance does that have to us? Is there a benefit of gluing 24 frames together? Well, this ties in a little bit to signaling. Sure, we want to take these voice samples. We want to take these 8-bit samples from each of our 24 channels. We want to send those across the network. But hold on, we have to have some other information going across that T1 as well. We've got to have signaling information. We need to know when somebody goes off hook. We need to know when somebody goes on hook. How do we do that type of thing? Well, a couple of options. There is CAS, channel associated signaling, or there is CCS, common channel signaling. Let's talk about these two options. CAS, or channel associated signaling, is going to take some bits from within the super frame or within the extended super frame, and it's going to use those bits to send some signaling information. It's called robbed bit signaling in the T1 world. More on that in just a second, but I'll tell you how it's mainly done in today's world, and that is we use common channel signaling. Common channel signaling says I'm going to dedicate typically a single channel, could be more, but typically it's a single channel, like the 24th channel on a T1. I'm going to dedicate that channel to nothing else but sending a signaling protocol. That's the way ISDN works. If you're dealing with a T1-based ISDN circuit, it's running Q921 at layer 2, Q931 at layer 3. Those signaling protocols are running over your 24th channel, which means that, well, you've only got 23 channels remaining. You can only have 23 simultaneous voice calls going over those channels, and your 24th channel is dedicated to signaling. But if you've got several T1s, what Cisco lets you do is something called NFAS, N-F-A-S, non-facility associated signaling. And what that does, it can allow the signaling channel for one T1 to also be the signaling channel for as many as 19 additional T1s. You can have 20 T1s, 24 channels each, and out of all those channels, you're only using one channel to send signaling. So I'm personally a big fan of doing it that way, of doing a common channel signaling as opposed to channel-associated signaling. My viewpoint is that it's better to get much more robust signaling than to squeeze out another channel that we can use. And I mean much more robust signaling. We're going to get very rudimentary signaling if we're using channel-associated signaling. We're only going to have at a maximum 4 bits of information per channel. They're called the A, B, C, and D bits. And those bit combinations can say, are we on hook? Are we off hook? It can send very basic signaling information. But if we're running a signaling protocol like Q.931 on an ISDN circuit, we get lots of information. We can have cause codes. Why did the call terminate? What bandwidth do we have on the circuit? What's the calling number? What's the called number? We get lots of great information, which is super valuable when troubleshooting. But if we are using a CAS, or channel-associated signaling, and we're using a super frame, we've only got 2 bits. What we do is go into every 6th frame in a super frame, and we rob the low-order bit from all 24 channels in the 6th frame and in the 12th frame. So in those 2 frames for each of our channels, instead of having 8 bits representing our voice, we've only got 7 bits representing our voice. Does that degrade voice quality? Technically, yes. I probably wouldn't be able to tell it if I were just listening to it. But technically, yes, it is a measurable degradation of voice quality. We've got more signaling bits. If we have an extended super frame circuit, we still go into every 6th frame, and we rob the low-order sampling bit from every channel. So we go into frames 6, 12, 18, 24, and in each of those 24 channels represented in each of these frames, we take the low order bit and we use that for signaling. This gives us 4 bits. They're called the A, B, C, and D bits. Which begs the question, we're talking about on-hook conditions, off-hook conditions. How can I have an analog phone somehow set an A bit or a B bit? Well, there's another piece of equipment that we often have in a T1 environment. It's called a channel bank. Think of a router connecting into this device called a channel bank. Well, this channel bank is sort of a converter. It can convert between the digital world and the analog world. It can have a T1 port connecting into the T1 circuit, and it can have other analog ports like an FXS, a foreign exchange station port. Now, an FXS port, that's an analog port that connects out to a station. That's the easy way to remember it. FXS, foreign exchange station, connects to a station, like a phone, like a fax machine, like a speakerphone. FXO, foreign exchange office, connects to an office, like a central office. And there's one I didn't list here that's not used very much. It's called E&M, ear and mouth, or earth and magneto, depending on what literature you read. But that's often used to connect into existing PBXs. You see, back in the day, companies had PBXs, private branch exchanges, privately owned telephone switches, at different locations within their company. And they would have this dedicated circuit to interconnect the PBXs. And it was common to use an E&M port to interconnect those PBXs. Well, if you want to preserve your customer's existing investment in their E&M port, you could technically get an E&M port for your router or your channel bank. And what the channel bank is going to do, it's going to take the signaling that it sees on the analog port coming in, whether it's FXS, FXO, E&M, it's going to take that signaling. Maybe that analog phone on screen just went off hook. Well, that's supervisory signaling to say, hey, we just went off hook. What the channel bank is then going to do, it's going to set an appropriate bit or bits among the A, B, C, and D bits to indicate that on this channel in my 24-channel T1, the device just went off hook. Now, if we have a super frame instead of an extended super frame, we're not able to represent as much signaling. We're not able to do much with an E&M port, for example, because we've only got 2 bits. We've got more flexibility with an extended super frame, but still, it's very basic signaling information. It's not near as robust as we could get with something like ISDN, where we're running a dedicated signaling protocol. But what I need you to understand is that when we're setting up a T1, we've got options for framing. We're going to be setting up a super frame, 12 frames glued together. Each of those frames are 193 bits in size. Extended super frame, which is much more common, we've got 24 frames glued together. Now that's with a T1 circuit. What about an E1 circuit? Well, an E1 circuit doesn't use the concept of a super frame or an extended super frame. It uses something called a multi-frame. And a multi-frame is a grouping of 16 E1 frames. And an E1 has 32 channels. Remember, a T1 had 24 channels? Well, an E1 has 32 channels. However, all of those are not usable for voice. The first of these 32 channels, all the time, is used for framing and synchronization. You're not going to be sending a voice over that first channel. Also, the 17th channel is dedicated to signaling. Now, it's signaling in the sense that, yes, we could do common channel signaling. We could send a signaling protocol using time slot 17, or if we were using CAS, channel associated signaling, we could send our A, B, C, and D bits in time slot 17. Which begs the question, why would you do that? You're not even getting the benefit of carving out an extra voice channel by doing this. Why would you do CAS with an E1? Well, the only answer I can come up with is you want to be backwards compatible to something that's already configured that way. But normally what we're going to have with an E1 is we're going to have some signaling protocol like Q.921, Q.931. It's running there in time slot 17, carrying a tremendous amount of signaling information. However, just for completion's sake, let me show you how it works with channel-associated signaling. What we do in time slot 17 for the very first frame is we set some bits to say that this is the beginning of an E1 multi-frame. Now let's go to the next frame. In the second frame, time slot 17, we've got 8 bits. Remember, we're using 8-bit samples. We've got 8 bits, which is twice the number of bits we need for an A, B, C, and D bit combination for a channel. Let's split it up. What we will do is use 4 of those bits in time slot 17 as the A, B, C, and D bits, which a channel bank could set. We're going to use 4 of those bits as the A, B, C, and D bits for time slot 2, our first usable voice channel. We've got 4 bits left out of those 8 bits. We're going to use those 4 bits as the A, B, C, and D bits for time slot 18. And as you might be able to predict, when we get to the third frame, we're going to go into time slot 17, and we're going to use 4 bits as the A, B, C, and D bits for time slot 3, and 4 bits for the A, B, C, and D bits for time slot 19. And if we continue this all the way down, all the way through our 16 frames, it comes out perfect. We've got 4 bits, A, B, C, and D bits, for each of our usable channels. That's the way an E1 multi-frame works. So to summarize, An E1 can have its framing set to superframe or extended superframe. An E1, however, is going to use a multi-frame. Something else that we need to know as we're configuring a T1 or an E1 circuit is line coding. How do we represent bits on the wire? Well, the basic approach of doing this is something called AMI, or alternate mark inversion. The idea is this. We're sending binary data. We're sending ones and zeros. And when I send a binary 1, I'm going to represent that with the presence of voltage. When I send a binary 0, that's going to be represented by the absence of voltage. Let's take a look at a few examples here. You see I've got this timeline divided into different bit positions. Let's say for the very first bit that comes through, remember we're synchronized, so we're able to tell approximately when one bit stops and another bit starts. And for the first bit position for that first timing interval, there was no voltage on the wire. Well, that's going to be interpreted as a binary value of 0. Let's say that we wanted to send a binary 1 now. Okay, let's say that it's going to be this time a positive voltage. Another binary 0 is the absence of voltage, but here's where it gets interesting. Let's say that we want to send another binary 1. Here's what alternate means in alternate mark inversion. We want to alternate the polarity. We sent a positive voltage the time before. We want to send a negative voltage this time. It still represents a binary 1, but this time it's a negative voltage. Why do we do that? Well, we get better electrical characteristics on the wire if we have an average of 0 volts on the wire. Think about it. That's really what we have, isn't it? If I send a bunch of binary 1s and half of them are positive and half of them are negative, and the binary 0s are no voltage at all, what's the average? It's about 0, isn't it? I remember many years ago I was trying to teach this concept to some of my students, and the best metaphor I could use to share with them was this. If I take one of my hands and I stick it in a bucket of ice cold freezing water, and I take my other hand and I stick it in a pan of boiling hot water, on average, I'm going to be comfortable. Okay, no, it doesn't work that way for humans, but that is the way it works for our binary data representation. We have an average of 0 volts. There's an issue though. Still staying with alternate mark inversion for a moment, let's say that one of the bytes that we're sending, one of the 8 bits that we're sending, is all zeros. We've got a byte composed of 8 binary bits, and they're all zeros. That's what we're seeing here on screen. Notice I've indicated the start of the byte and the end of the byte. All those bits in that byte, they're zeros. That can cause an issue with some equipment. Some equipment can get a little bit confused as to where one bit stops and another bit starts because there's basically been silence on the wire for a period of time, and we're not sure exactly how many bits that represents. So we need another mechanism to represent a byte containing all zeros. In the T1 world, here's typically how it's done. We typically use something called B8ZS, which stands for bipolar 8-0 substitution. Let's say that we've got a positive voltage representing a binary 1 just before this byte containing all zeros. Well, if we're using B8ZS, the equipment sees that, oh, here's a byte and it's all zeros. All the bits are zeros. What we're going to do is cause a bipolar violation. Ooh, that sounds serious, doesn't it? What we're going to do at the 4th bit position in that byte containing all zeros, instead of just sending no voltage, saying it's a 0, send no voltage, no, we're going to create a bipolar violation. Notice the previous time we sent a binary 1, the previous time that we saw voltage, it was positive. Check this out. We're going to send another positive voltage. That is a bipolar violation. But if the equipment is told to use B8ZS, it can recognize bipolar violations at very specific bit positions. It can recognize that as a code way of saying, hey, this isn't really a violation. This is representing a byte that contains all zeros. Now, remember one of the goals we had. We want to have an average of 0 volts on the wire. Well, I just sent another positive voltage. To make up for that, I want to send a balancing voltage after that. So in the 5th bit position, I'll send a negative voltage to balance things out. And as part of B8ZS, we're going to send not just one bipolar violation, but we're going to send 2 bipolar violations. I guess 2 wrongs really do make a right with B8ZS. We send another negative voltage. And after we do that, we have to send a balancing voltage, so we still have 0 volts on average on the wire. Why do we do that second bipolar violation? Well, it might be so that we're going to pick up the way we left off. Before this byte containing all zeros, the previous binary 1 was positive. Well, same thing here. The last voltage that was sent on the wire was positive. So after this, the next time we send a binary 1, it's going to be negative. we've created two bipolar violations at very specific bit positions in equipment that was told to use B8ZS. That's the way that the equipment knows that this is not really a violation or two violations. This is simply a byte containing all zeros. Now, B8ZS is not an option for an E1 circuit. With an E1 circuit, we typically use something else, and it's called HDB3, which stands for High Density Bipolar of Order 3. That's a mouthful, and it's going to attack this issue a little bit differently. The 3 in HDB3 means that the goal for this approach, the goal for this line coding method, is to never have more than 3 binary zeros in a row. And we've got a case where we have 8 binary zeros in a row. What's going to happen now? Well, let's do it like we did with the T1. Let's say before this byte containing all zeros begins, we'll say that the previous binary 1 was represented with the positive voltage. Well, here, we're 3 bits into this byte, and HDB3 says we never want to have more than 3 consecutive bits that are all zeros. So what do? We're going to create a bipolar violation at bit position 4 inside of this byte. And if this byte just had the first 4 bits as zeros, and we did have some 1s in the last 4 bits, we'd be done now. HDB3 would say, all right, I'm going to create this one bipolar violation for this one set of 4 bits that were all zeros, because HDB3 says we never want to have more than 3 bits in a row that are all zeros. However, in our case, we've got a byte. We've got 8 bits that are all zeros. What happens next? Well, after we've done this once, we don't want to just send no voltage for 3 more bit positions and then send another bipolar violation. We're starting to tip the scales a little bit on the side of positive voltage. We don't want to do that. So if you just created a bipolar violation and it ended in a positive voltage, we're going to do another bipolar violation with the opposite voltage. That's one of the goals of HDB3. Subsequent bipolar violations should be of opposite polarities. This bipolar violation used a positive polarity. The next bipolar violation we create, we want it to be negative. In order for that to happen, we're going to send our balancing voltage here. That's going to give us an average of 0 volts on the wire. And when we get to the 4th, actually the 8th bit position, the 4th bit position in that second set of 4 bits, but when we get to that last bit position in the byte, we're going to send another negative voltage. We're going to create another bipolar violation. So HDB3 is not just targeting bytes containing all zeros, it's targeting times when we have 4 consecutive zeros. The first time, it just waits through 3-bit positions, creates a bipolar violation, but the next time, if it happens again, we want to make sure that next bipolar violation happens at the opposite polarity, and in order to make that happen, we might need to send a voltage of the opposite polarity of the bipolar violation. That's what we did here in bit position 5, so that our violation can be of the opposite polarity. Well, that's the theory of T1s, E1s, framing, line coding, speeds, and I really think it's safe to say that at this point, you know more about this topic of how HDB3 works and how B8ZS works, superframes, multiframes, extended superframes. You know more about that than I would say over 95% of those with Cisco collaboration certifications. And now that we've talked theory, it's time to go out to the live interface and let's see how we can configure a T1 circuit, an E1 circuit, and what sort of verification and troubleshooting commands can we give. We're sitting here on a Cisco 2911 router, and it's named BR1, and we want to set up a T1. And one of the ways I like to start out is to see exactly what sort of hardware do I have installed. Let's do a show inventory to get started, and this is telling me that I've got a VWIC2 2MFT T1/E1. What does all that mean? Well, VWIC2 means it's a second generation of the voice WAN interface card. 2MFT stands for 2 multiplex trunks. I've got 2 ports in this voice WAN interface card, and T1/E1 tells me this is not necessarily a T1 or an E1. I get to pick. I can configure it as either one. Now, where is this installed? Well, we're installed on slot 0. Now, on a 2911 router, slot 0 represents the motherboard. And the motherboard controls 4 WIC slots, 4 open bays where we can slide in WICs and VWICs in the back of this router. So slot 0 means it's controlled by the motherboard. This T1 is not living on a large module, a network module that I installed in the big open bay on the back of the router. Subslot 0 says that I'm in the first of the 4 slots on the back of the router that are controlled by the motherboard. Numbering starts at 0, 0, 1, 2, and 3. I'm in the first one, and they're labeled on the back of the router if you're not sure where the first one is. The numbering typically starts down and to the right, so it's slot 0, subslot 0, and if I want to set up the first port, because we've got 2 ports, that's what 2 MFT means. If I want to set up the first of those ports, the numbering starts at 0, I would be setting up controller 0/0/0. If I wanted to set up the second of those slots, I would set up controller T1 0/0/1. Let's take a look at 0/0/0. Let's first say that this is going to be a T1 as opposed to an E1. To do that, I'll say card type. Let's give some context sensitive help. Here's where I can say, do I want to be a T1 or do I want to be an E1? Well, I want to be a T1. And what's my slot? Well, it's the motherboard. It's not a network module, so my slot is 0. What is my WAN interface card slot? Well, there are 4 of them, 0 through 3. I'm in 0. No need to say the port here, because when I set the WIC to be a T1, it's going to be a T1 for both ports. You cannot have one that's a T1 and one that's an E1 on the very same voice WAN interface card. So I've now made this module be a T1, which means I can now go into controller configuration mode for each of my T1 ports. Let's go into controller T1 0/0/0. Let's administratively bring this up so we don't forget that. I'll do a no shutdown. Looks like we're administratively up now. And let's think about some of the parameters that we talked about earlier. I can set, for example, the line coding. We discussed AMI, alternate mark inversion, versus B8ZS, bipolar 8-0 substitution. We typically use B8ZS. I'll set the line code to that. What about the framing? Remember, we had options of superframe or extended superframe. Typically, we use extended superframe. I'll select that. And we also said that a T1 could run in channel associated signaling mode, or it could run in common channel signaling mode. We typically do common channel signaling. We typically use something like an ISDN configuration, where we're using ISDN signaling protocols running over channel 24. However, I want to show you both ways. Let's say that I did want to connect this T1 into a channel bank, and this channel bank was feeding some phones, just regular analog phones. So maybe I wanted to say that the first 8 time slots on this T1 controller used FXS loop start signaling, which is really common for traditional analog phones. Here's what I could do. I could create a DS0 group. A DS0 means one of these 24 channels. I'm going to say in controller configuration mode that I want to create a DS0 group, and I can give this a number. You can see I could have a group for each of my channels. I'm just going to say group. I typically would say 0 right here, but just to make it stand out in one of the show commands I'm going to give later, I'm going to call this number 5. DS0 group 5 for no particular reason. I just don't want it to be another 0. We've got a lot of zeros already. DS0 group 5. And I can assign time slots to this group. And if I want to assign the first 8 time slots, I'm going to say 1-8. And then I can say what kind of signaling does it use. The type of signaling, let's say, is going to be FXS, foreign exchange station, loop start. And when I do that, it creates this virtual voice port of 0/0/0:5. In fact, let's do this to prove it. I'll do a show voice port summary command, and notice my port. I've got 0/0/0:5. That 5 is the number of my DS0 group. And you see that I've got 8 channels, 01 through 08. Notice the signaling type. They're all using FXS loop start. So as I go into a channel bank, I'm going to be looking for appropriate A, B, C, or D bits to reflect on-hook, off-hook status for a foreign exchange station loop start connection. But honestly, in the real world, we don't use that as much, but I wanted to show it to you for completion. Let me show you, though, something that's much more common. Let's go over to another router. I've already got this router set up to be an ISDN PRI, a primary rate interface connection using a T1. The ISDN configuration is sitting on top of the T1, and I've already got this set up. Let me just show you the running config. Notice I've gone in like we did on our other router, and I said the card type is T1. Scroll down a bit further, and notice that I've globally said what is the ISDN switch type. I said it's primary-NI. You want to be compatible with whatever the other end of your connection is. So you want to check with your telecommunications person if you're not that person, and make sure that you're specifying the appropriate ISDN switch type. Now this ISDN switch type can be inherited by all of our different T1 circuits if we want. However, we could override that on a circuit-by-circuit basis. I'll show you how to do that. Let's scroll down to the controller configuration mode, and I want to show you that I didn't set up a DS0 group because we're using ISDN. I set up a PRI group. I said PRI group, primary rate interface group, time slots. And here it says 1-3, 24. This means that I'm using the first 3 channels as part of this PRI group. Now the comma 24, the 24 has to be there because the 24th channel with an ISDN connection is our signaling channel. By the way, as a time saver, I didn't have to type in comma 24. In fact, I probably didn't. You can just type in PRI-group time slots 1-3 if that's what you want, and the comma 24 is going to be added because it's got to be there. Got to have a signaling channel. Let me show you something else that's interesting. We call that signaling channel the D channel, and we can go in and we can configure some parameters for that D channel, and I think it's interesting how it shows up. It shows up as a serial interface. Here it is. Interface serial 0/0/0:23. The 0/0/0, that's our T1 controller's address, and the :23 represents the D channel, the signaling channel. Hold on, didn't we say the 24th channel is the signaling channel? Yes. However, with our interfaces, the numbering starts at 0. So 23 really is the 24th channel. And here we're saying things like, when a call comes in, go to voice DSPs. You see, back in the day, remember when you used to dial into bulletin boards or your internet service provider over a modem? Well, Cisco had internal modems that you could put in the routers. They were called MICA modems. You could come in over this ISDN circuit and your call would be diverted to this internal MICA modem. But now we're not using these modems. We want a call coming in to go to voice DSPs, digital signal processors. So what we're saying is, send an incoming call to voice. It's a voice call coming in. Go to your DSPs. Oh, remember I said that we could override on a circuit-by-circuit basis the ISDN switch type? Here's how we can do that. This matches what I have at the global configuration level, but I could override it here if I wanted to. I've also got a couple of commands that I typically make sure are there to make sure that I'm sending all of my caller ID information, redirecting number, maybe for voicemail. I want to make sure my name and my number showing up on caller ID. I like all of my caller ID information to show up. But I wanted to point out that this is how we get into the D channel. In fact, let's take a look at a couple of verification commands. Let's say we're doing verification or troubleshooting. My favorite ISDN show command is show ISDN status. And the reason I say it's my favorite command, it gives me a snapshot of my circuit health at layer 1, layer 2, and layer 3 of the OSI model. At layer 1, it says we're active. That's great news. Layer 2 status, it says multiple frame established. That's what you want. If it says TEI assigned, that's probably not what you want. You want it to say multiple frame established. And right now I don't have any active calls, but if I did, I could see that under my layer 3 status. And remember I was telling you earlier in this video that we could get a robust set of information from ISDN signaling as opposed to just having 4 bits at our disposal, the A, B, C, and D bits. Let me show you what I meant by that. I'm going to do a debug. This is my favorite debug command for ISDN, by the way. Debug ISDN Q931. We're going to be seeing Q931 output on the screen. I'm going to go over and place a call from this HQ site to a phone out on my PSTN. And let's take a look at the Q931 messages that pop up. Well, I just call that number and then I hung up, but look at all the information that we get. We see that this is a 64K circuit as opposed to 56. We see which channel I'm using. Here's the name of the phone that placed the call. It has a name of HQ Phone 1. Here's its calling party number. It was 222-2001. The ISDN ton information, ISDN subscriber, because this is a local call. If it was long distance, the type would be national. If it was international, the type would be international. The called number going out to the PSTN is 222-2020. It's also a local number, subscriber. We can see the Q931 messages getting the call set up, and then it was normal call clearing. I simply hung up. There was not an error that occurred. I'll do a U all to turn off my debugging. But that's the power of having a signaling protocol rather than just a few bits to indicate when we go on hook or off hook. And we still need to talk about E1s. I've got a module set up to be an E1 module. It's got 2 ports over on router BR2. Let's go in to E1 controller configuration. I don't have any configuration on the second port on that WAN interface card. Let's go into controller E1 0/0/1, and let's take a look at some of the options we have. Remember when we were setting up framing for a T1, we had the option of super frame or extended super frame. If I'm setting up framing for an E1, it's a multi-frame. We don't have an option. It is going to be an E1 multi-frame. So what are the options that we have here? CRC4 or no CRC4. CRC4, that's a cyclical redundancy check. It's an error checking mechanism. And in a lot of European telephone switches, you're required to use CRC4. But there might be some older PBXs that you run into that don't support CRC4. You need to be compatible with whatever you're connecting into. I'll say that the framing is CRC4 in this case. What about the line coding? We'll say line code. And we talked about these 2 options, AMI, alternate mark inversion, or HDB3. Remember the 3 saying we do not want to have more than 3 consecutive bits that are zeros. And I'll say that we're going to use HDB3. And one other thing I want to show you, remember how we went into the D channel on that T1? It was serial 0/0/0:23. Check this out. This really confused me for a long time, and I want to make sure that you're straight on it. Let's scroll down to the D channel configuration. There's my PRI group, by the way, before I get there. Notice the time slots 1-3, 16. I'm using channels 1 through 3, and then this is my signaling channel, but hold on. Didn't we say that the signaling channel was channel 17? Yes. However, remember we've got 32 channels on an E1. The first channel is always dedicated to framing and synchronization. And as a result, Cisco doesn't count it. We're not going to reference that first channel. From the perspective of this router, we've only got 31 channels. It ignores that framing and synchronization channel. So that 17th channel, if we look at all 32 channels, is really the 16th channel if we ignore the first one. And that's going to help us better understand this. When we go into the D channel, we're going into serial 0/0/0:15. Okay, it's the 17th channel, that's the signaling channel. Why are we going into 15? Well, we just said our router is ignoring the existence of the first channel. It ignores the framing and synchronization channel. Okay, so that means our 17th channel becomes our 16th channel. Why does it say 15 here? Because with an interface, the numbering starts at 0. And we've got a similar set of commands here that we saw for our T1 that was set up for ISDN. That's a live look at how we can configure a DS0 group for a T1. If we want to do channel associated signaling, we've taken a look at how we can do common channel signaling with ISDN for both a T1 and an E1. If you want to learn even more about Cisco collaboration technologies, just click the link in the description or on the right side of the screen, and I'll send you more training videos. And if you don't want to miss any of my YouTube videos, be sure and subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.